The rumble of Frank Johnson's old Ford pickup resonated across the silent expanse of cornfields stretching endlessly into the darkness. The night was cold, with stars scattered across the vast rural sky, their light faintly illuminating the isolated road. It was the kind of stillness Frank had come to cherish in his later years. The heater in the cabin hummed weakly, offering modest relief from the frosty air outside. At 78, Frank had seen more than his share of chaos and violence, and he now found solace in these quiet drives home. He had spent the day at his daughter Susan's house, tending to her garden, and was returning to the familiar simplicity of his small, well-kept home on the edge of town. The pickup's dim headlights carved a narrow path through the pitch-black night. The world outside was eerily still, save for the occasional rustle of the wind moving through the tall corn. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around you, equal parts calming and disconcerting. As the truck rolled on, something unusual caught Frank's attention, a solitary motorcycle on the roadside. Its gleaming black body reflected the moonlight faintly, a stark contrast to the muted tones of the surrounding fields. Frank slowed the truck, his curiosity piqued. Next to the bike knelt a man, his large frame bent as he worked at something near the chain. The sight was strange, not because it was unusual to see a stranded traveler, but because it broke the monotonous tranquility of the night. Instinctively, Frank's thoughts turned to his military days, when a seemingly mundane detail often hinted at something more significant. Easing the truck to a stop a few feet ahead of the bike, Frank switched off the engine and stepped out. The cold air hit him like a wall, crisp and biting against his skin. He zipped up his weathered jacket and approached the motorcycle cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder of the road. "Evening," Frank called out, his voice calm and even, though there was a practiced edge to it, a remnant of his years as a soldier. The man by the motorcycle stood up slowly, unfolding to his full height. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a well-worn leather jacket that creaked slightly with the movement. A faint cloud of breath escaped his lips in the chill night air. "Evening," the man replied, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Name's Ethan. Ethan Clark." Frank extended a hand. "Frank Johnson," he said, his grip firm despite the ache in his joints. "Trouble with the bike?" Ethan nodded toward the broken chain hanging limply from the rear wheel. "Snapped clean off. Can't get it back on the road like this." Frank crouched beside the bike, his sharp eyes assessing the damage. Decades of farm life had taught him to repair just about anything with the tools at hand, and his old instincts kicked in as he calculated a temporary fix. "Got some tools in my truck," Frank offered. "Might not be perfect, but I can get you moving again." Ethan gave a small, grateful smile, though something in his eyes flickered, an emotion Frank couldn't quite place. "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said, stepping aside to give Frank room. Frank walked back to his truck, the quiet of the night enveloping him. He fetched a toolbox from behind the seat and returned, crouching down by the motorcycle once more. As his hands worked, his mind drifted. There was something about Ethan, his stillness, his posture, that set Frank's nerves on edge. He wasn't nervous exactly, but decades of soldiering had left him with a finely tuned sense of when something wasn't right. "Where you headed?" Frank asked, breaking the silence as he tightened a bolt on the frame. "West," Ethan replied simply. "Just passing through." Frank nodded, though the answer felt incomplete. The rural backroads weren't exactly a thoroughfare for casual travelers, and Ethan's clipped responses left questions hanging in the air. Still, Frank had no intention of prying. He focused on the chain, threading it back into place with careful precision. The sound of their breaths mingling in the cold air was the only noise besides the occasional creak of the bike. Frank couldn't help but notice how Ethan's eyes darted now and then, scanning the horizon as though expecting company. It was subtle, but the behavior didn't fit the profile of a man simply stranded on the side of the road. As Frank worked, Ethan seemed to watch him intently, not just out of gratitude but with a calculating sharpness. "Not many folks stop to help a stranger these days," Ethan remarked, his voice low but steady. Frank smiled faintly. "Guess I'm old-fashioned. Out here, we look out for each other. Besides, I've been stranded before. It's not something I'd wish on anyone." The two men fell into a companionable silence, though the tension remained, humming just below the surface. Frank tested the repaired chain, pulling the bike forward slightly to ensure it would hold. "That should do it," he said, straightening up and brushing his hands off on his jeans. Ethan inspected the work, nodding appreciatively. "Thanks, Frank. You didn't have to stop, but I'm glad you did." Frank shrugged modestly. "Just the way I was raised." He glanced toward the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather, their edges illuminated faintly by the moonlight. "You'd better get going," Frank said, a note of warning in his voice. "Looks like a storm's coming." Ethan followed Frank's gaze but didn't move. His eyes lingered on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned back to Frank, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "You ever serve in the military?" Frank paused, the question catching him off guard. He measured Ethan carefully before answering. "A long time ago." Ethan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Figures," he muttered, more to himself than to Frank. The exchange left Frank uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint why. With a polite nod, he turned back to his truck, the engine still idling in the cool night air. As he climbed inside and pulled back onto the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Ethan stood motionless by his motorcycle, his silhouette framed against the storm clouds looming in the distance, watching Frank's taillights fade into the night. Though Frank drove on, the encounter lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. There was something about Ethan, something unfinished, that made the vast emptiness of the road ahead feel a little less safe. Frank Johnson's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his pickup hummed along the empty road. The encounter with Ethan left a weight pressing on his chest, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Strangers often crossed paths out here, usually with little more than a wave or a shared cup of coffee at the town diner. But Ethan was different. The way his eyes moved, the way his body tensed, it wasn't the demeanor of a lost traveler. It was the posture of a man accustomed to assessing danger. The old soldier shook his head, trying to dismiss the gnawing feeling. He had no desire to revisit the past. Those years were long gone, buried beneath decades of planting fields, fixing fences, and raising a family. Still, the past had a way of clinging to you, no matter how deeply you tried to bury it. Frank had once been someone entirely different. Known among his comrades as the Bonebreaker, he had been an elite soldier, operating in the shadows of wars that didn't make headlines. His skill in close combat was unmatched, his ability to infiltrate enemy lines a thing of legend. But with every mission, every victory, a piece of his soul had chipped away, leaving behind scars invisible to the naked eye. When the time came to walk away, he did so with no regrets, determined to trade the chaos of battle for the serenity of rural life. Yet, as Frank thought back to the man on the roadside, the instincts he'd honed during those years screamed at him to stay alert. Something wasn't right. He'd learned to trust that feeling, even if it often brought trouble. The crackle of gravel under his tires faded as Frank turned onto the paved driveway leading to his home. The small farmhouse stood in the moonlight, its white paint faded but clean, the porch light casting a warm glow. It was a modest home, but it represented everything Frank had fought for: peace, family, and a life free from violence. He parked the truck and stepped out, stretching his back. The chill in the air was sharper now, and the faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. He retrieved his toolbox from the back of the truck and made his way inside. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of an old clock in the living room. Frank set the toolbox on the kitchen counter, but his mind drifted back to Ethan's bike. The chain had snapped cleanly, too cleanly. He had seen enough mechanical failures to know what wear and tear looked like, and this wasn't it. That chain had been deliberately damaged, though he hadn't mentioned it at the time. Why would someone sabotage their own bike? And why on a road where the nearest help might take hours to find? Pouring himself a cup of black coffee, Frank sank into his favorite armchair. The memories he worked so hard to suppress began to creep in, as they often did when something unsettled him. Missions that required precision, strength, and an unsettling coldness flashed through his mind. He could still feel the weight of a rifle against his shoulder, the ache in his knuckles from fights that left men broken and bleeding. He had walked away from all of it. Or so he thought. The faint creak of the porch steps pulled Frank from his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat, his muscles tensing reflexively. No one visited this late, not without calling first. He set the coffee mug down silently, the years of training returning like a tide. Moving to the window, he peered out cautiously. The porch light revealed nothing but the empty wooden steps and the wind stirring the bushes near the front of the house. Still, the unease remained. The next morning, Frank decided to put the encounter behind him. Life had a way of moving forward, and he intended to do the same. He spent the day working in the garden, mending a section of broken fence, and checking on his neighbor's cattle. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lingering tension from the night before returned. By the time Frank settled back into his armchair that evening, the storm had rolled in. Rain battered against the windows, and the wind howled like a restless spirit. The soft glow of the lamp beside him cast long shadows across the room. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm. But it grew louder, more insistent. Frank stood, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through his veins. He grabbed the old shotgun mounted above the doorframe, not out of fear, but out of caution. Opening the door just a crack, he was greeted by a familiar face. Ethan stood on the porch, rain dripping from his leather jacket, his expression guarded. "Sorry to bother you, Frank," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I ran into some trouble. Figured you might be the only person around who could help." Frank's grip on the shotgun tightened imperceptibly. Trouble? Of course. But he couldn't turn the man away, not without knowing more. "Come in," Frank said, stepping aside. Ethan entered, his presence filling the small room. He looked around briefly, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Nice place," he remarked, though his tone lacked warmth. Frank set the shotgun back in its place but kept his senses on high alert. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" he asked, his voice steady. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Let's just say I've got people looking for me. And they're not the friendly type." Frank frowned. This was exactly the kind of thing he had hoped to leave behind. Yet here it was, standing in his living room, dripping rain onto the wooden floor. "You brought them here?" Frank asked, his tone hardening. "No," Ethan said quickly. "At least, I don't think so. But I couldn't keep moving in this storm. Just needed a place to lay low for the night." Frank studied the man carefully. There was more to this story. He could feel it. And something told him that by letting Ethan in, he was inviting trouble into his life once more. But he also knew what it meant to be desperate, to have nowhere else to turn. With a heavy sigh, Frank nodded. "You can stay the night. But come morning, you'd better be on your way." Ethan gave a small, almost reluctant nod. "Thanks, Frank. I owe you one." Frank didn't reply. As he fetched a spare blanket from the closet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Ethan's presence was a spark in a dry forest, and it was only a matter of time before the flames followed. The morning broke with a muted gray light filtering through the storm clouds, casting long shadows across Frank Johnson's front porch. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and a tension Frank couldn't ignore. Ethan was awake before Frank, standing by the window with a distant expression. His leather jacket hung over the back of a chair, damp and battered, much like the man himself. Frank, always an early riser, watched Ethan for a moment before stepping into the room. "Coffee's on," he said gruffly, his voice breaking the quiet. Ethan turned, offering a faint nod. "Thanks." The two men sat at the small kitchen table, the only sound between them the occasional clink of mugs and the steady drip of rain outside. Frank was not one for unnecessary conversation, but the weight of the silence pressed on him. "You want to tell me the truth now?" Frank finally asked, his tone measured but firm. "What kind of trouble are you really in?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of his mug. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Frank's with a seriousness that made the older man's stomach knot. "You're not just a guy with a truck and a toolkit, are you?" Ethan said, ignoring the question entirely. Frank's brow furrowed, his grip tightening around his mug. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under his weight. I did my homework, he said, his voice low and steady. Frank Johnson. Former Special Forces. Decorated veteran. You've got a reputation, even if you've spent the last few decades hiding behind a rake and a garden hose. The words hit Frank like a gut punch. He set the mug down carefully, his jaw tightening as old memories clawed their way to the surface. I don't know where you got that, he said slowly, but it's not who I am anymore. Ethan smirked, though it lacked any real humor. Maybe not. But some things don't just disappear. Especially when people like me go looking for them. Frank stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You've overstayed your welcome, he said coldly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded others. Time to move on. Ethan raised his hands in a placating gesture but didn't stand. I'm not here to make trouble for you, Frank. I'm here because I need you. Because someone else sent me. The room seemed to grow colder as Ethan's words hung in the air. Frank's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't interrupt. There's a man, Ethan continued, his tone softening slightly. A very powerful man. He runs a network, fights, money, control. And he's got a thing for legends. He knows about you, Frank. He knows everything. And he sent me here to see if the stories are true. Frank's breath came slower, heavier, as the implications settled in. What does he want? Ethan finally stood, his movements deliberate, as though trying not to spook a wild animal. He wants you to fight, he said simply. One match, that's all. To prove you're still the man they say you are. Frank let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. And if I refuse? Ethan's jaw tightened. He doesn't take no for an answer. I didn't come here to threaten you, but he knows about your family. Your daughter, your granddaughter. The room seemed to close in on Frank. The mention of Susan and Emily sent a chill through his veins, colder than any storm. You son of a, Frank growled, stepping forward, his hands curling into fists. Easy, Ethan said quickly, raising his hands again. I'm just the messenger here, Frank. I don't want them involved any more than you do. Frank stopped short, his chest heaving with the effort to rein in his anger. He turned away, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. The past he had worked so hard to escape had caught up to him, and now it threatened everything he held dear. You said this guy wants a fight, Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why send you to deliver the message? Why the games with the bike and the storm? Ethan hesitated, his expression flickering with something like guilt. Because he wanted me to make sure you still had it, he admitted. And because he doesn't like loose ends. If I don't come back with you, Frank, I don't come back at all. Frank turned to face Ethan again, his eyes cold and hard. That sounds like your problem. It'll be your family's problem, too, Ethan said quietly. The words cut deeper than Frank cared to admit. He could see the calculation in Ethan's expression, the way he measured every reaction. Frank had faced men like him before, men who thrived in the gray areas of morality, who made choices for survival, no matter the cost. But Frank wasn't that man anymore. Or so he wanted to believe. The sound of tires crunching gravel outside snapped both men to attention. Ethan moved to the window, peeking out cautiously. They're here, he muttered, his voice laced with tension. Frank grabbed the shotgun from above the doorframe, the old instincts roaring back to life. Who's they? Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim. His people. They're here to make sure you cooperate. Frank's grip tightened on the shotgun as he looked at Ethan, the younger man's face a mix of fear and resignation. You brought them here, Frank said, his voice heavy with accusation. I didn't have a choice, Ethan replied, his tone desperate. But neither do you now. Frank's mind raced as he weighed his options. The world outside his little farmhouse had invaded his sanctuary, and the battle he thought he'd left behind was suddenly at his doorstep. "Stay behind me," Frank ordered, his voice firm and unyielding. Ethan nodded silently, stepping back as Frank moved toward the door. The storm outside seemed to swell with the tension inside the house, the rain pounding harder against the windows. Frank's heart beat steadily as he braced himself. He had avoided this kind of confrontation for years, but now there was no escape. The door opened slowly, revealing two men standing in the rain, their figures backlit by the headlights of a black SUV. They were dressed in dark, heavy jackets, their postures casual but menacing. "Frank Johnson," one of them called out, his voice calm but authoritative. "We'd like to have a word." Frank stepped onto the porch, the shotgun resting in his hands, his eyes locking onto the men with a steely gaze. "I don't think we've got much to talk about," he replied evenly. The man smiled faintly. "Oh, I think we do." And with that, the fragile quiet of Frank's world shattered. The rain poured harder, soaking the two men standing on Frank's porch. Their dark jackets glistened under the headlights of the SUV idling on the driveway. Frank's grip on the shotgun remained steady, his eyes locked on the taller of the two intruders. The man's expression was calm, almost casual, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that Frank recognized immediately. These weren't just hired muscle, they were professionals. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the taller man said, his voice smooth and measured, as though he had all the time in the world. "Let's not turn a simple request into something unpleasant." Frank's jaw tightened, his finger brushing the trigger guard of the shotgun. "If you know who I am, then you know this isn't my first standoff. And you'll know I don't respond well to threats." The second man, shorter but stockier, shifted his weight, the faint sound of his boots scraping against the wooden porch. "We're not here to fight you, old man," he said gruffly. "We're here to make sure you understand the stakes." Frank tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You show up on my land, uninvited, threatening my family, and expect me to stand down? You boys picked the wrong veteran to mess with." The taller man held up his hands in mock surrender, his smile faint and humorless. "We don't need to argue. The boss wants you at the fight. One match, like Ethan told you. Do that, and this all goes away." Frank's voice dropped, cold and sharp. "And if I don't?" The taller man's smile vanished. He gestured toward the SUV, and the stocky man opened the back door, revealing a tablet mounted on the seat. A video began to play, a shaky, zoomed-in clip of Susan walking Emily home from school. The image of his daughter and granddaughter, so oblivious to the danger surrounding them, sent a wave of fury through Frank's veins. "You've got a beautiful family," the tall man said, his tone darkening. "Be a shame if anything happened to them." Ethan, who had been standing behind Frank inside the doorway, muttered, "I told you, Frank. These guys don't play around." Frank's knuckles whitened as he gripped the shotgun. His mind raced, weighing the odds, calculating the risks. A frontal assault wouldn't work, not with these men, not with the SUV likely holding more of them. But giving in felt like betraying everything he had built. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my property," Frank said, his voice like steel. The taller man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Or what? You gonna shoot us?" "That's not the kind of attention you want, Frank." Frank didn't answer. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, raising the shotgun slightly. The taller man's hand twitched toward his jacket, and the stocky one mirrored the motion, but neither drew a weapon. They were cautious, clearly aware of what Frank was capable of. "This isn't over," the taller man said finally, stepping back toward the SUV. "You've got until tomorrow to decide. You show up, or your family pays the price." The stocky man smirked as he climbed into the vehicle. "Hope you're as good as the stories say, old-timer." Frank stood motionless, watching the SUV reverse down the driveway and disappear into the rain-soaked darkness. Only when the taillights were gone did he lower the shotgun, his breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his face pale. "They'll be watching you now," he said. "They won't let you out of their sight until you agree." Frank turned on him, his eyes blazing. "You brought this to my doorstep. You made my family a target. I didn't have a choice. Ethan shot back, his voice tinged with desperation. You think I wanted this? I'm as trapped as you are. Frank's chest heaved, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stepped inside and slammed the door shut, leaving Ethan standing on the porch. For the next hour, Frank paced the small living room, his mind a whirlwind of anger and dread. The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless drumbeat matching the thudding of his heart. He had spent decades avoiding violence, building a life of peace and quiet. Now, that life was being ripped away. His thoughts turned to Susan and Emily. He could already see the fear in Susan's eyes if she knew the danger they were in, the confusion on Emily's face as she tried to understand why her grandfather had brought trouble into their world. Frank stopped abruptly, his eyes falling on the old trunk tucked beneath the stairs. It had been years since he opened it, years since he let himself acknowledge the man he used to be. But now, he had no choice. He knelt and pulled the trunk into the center of the room, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked it. Inside were relics of another life, medals tarnished by time, a combat knife with a worn handle, and a battered photo of his old unit. Beneath it all was a pistol, meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. Ethan entered the room quietly, his face a mixture of guilt and curiosity. You're not seriously thinking about taking them on, are you? Frank glanced at him, his expression unreadable. What choice do I have? You could leave, Ethan said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Disappear, take your family somewhere safe. Frank shook his head. Running doesn't solve anything. It just delays the fight. They'll keep coming. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. So what's the plan? You can't take them all by yourself. Frank stood, tucking the pistol into his waistband. I don't need to take them all. I just need to send a message. Ethan frowned. You realize this isn't a movie, right? These guys play for keeps. You win one fight, they'll just find another way to use you. Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. One step at a time. As the storm outside began to wane, Frank's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the life he had worked so hard to build, the people he loved. Tomorrow would come too soon, and with it, a reckoning he couldn't avoid. For now, all he could do was prepare. The morning arrived cloaked in an eerie stillness, the remnants of the storm lingering in the heavy air. Frank stood in his backyard, his breath visible in the crisp chill. His hands moved methodically as he tightened the straps of an old combat harness across his chest, each motion a reluctant acknowledgement of the man he had once been. The calm of the rural surroundings offered no comfort. This wasn't a morning for quiet reflection. It was the calm before a battle he hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. Ethan lingered by the porch, shifting nervously. He watched Frank with a mix of admiration and apprehension. Despite his age, Frank's movements were precise, his posture steady. It was clear that the skills he had honed years ago were still intact, buried beneath the surface but ready to be called upon. They'll be watching the roads, Ethan warned, his voice low. You'll need to move fast, stay unpredictable. Frank glanced at him, his expression unreadable. I wasn't planning on taking the roads. Ethan blinked, confused, until Frank pointed toward the dense woods behind the house. The old hunting trail, Frank explained. It runs straight to the abandoned mill. They'll expect me to drive. I'll walk. Ethan hesitated. The mill. That's where they're holding the fight. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on the tree-line. It's isolated. No neighbors, no law enforcement nearby. Makes sense for their operation. Ethan shifted uneasily. They won't play fair, Frank. They'll have backup. Guns. If you show up unarmed. Frank cut him off with a sharp look. I know what I'm walking into. Ethan opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it. He had seen enough of Frank in action to understand that arguing would get him nowhere. Without another word, Frank slung a small pack over his shoulder and stepped into the woods, the dense foliage swallowing him whole. Ethan watched him go, a knot of guilt tightening in his chest. The forest was alive with the faint sounds of nature, The rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird. Frank moved through it like a ghost, his boots silent against the damp ground. His mind was a storm of calculations, weighing the risks and the odds. The memories of past battles resurfaced with every step, bringing with them a clarity he hadn't felt in years. When he reached the edge of the mill's property, he crouched low, scanning the area. The building was a hulking relic of rusted metal and broken windows, its once bustling machinery long silent. A few vehicles were parked outside, their occupants visible through the cracked glass of the main floor. Frank counted 4 men, all armed, stationed around the room. He exhaled slowly, his pulse steady despite the danger. This wasn't his first time facing overwhelming odds, and he doubted it would be his last. Slipping around the side of the building, Frank found a broken window leading into a storage area. He climbed through, his movements careful and deliberate. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and decay. The faint hum of voices carried from the main floor, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Frank pressed himself against the wall, his ears straining to pick up details. One voice stood out, a deep, commanding tone that matched the man from the night before. "He'll come," the voice said. "Men like him can't resist a challenge. He's predictable." Another voice chimed in, more hesitant. "What if he doesn't? Boss won't be happy if we come back empty-handed." "He'll come," the first man repeated confidently. "But we're ready either way." Frank's jaw tightened. They were waiting for him, just as he expected. But they hadn't anticipated that he would already be inside. Moving silently, Frank crept toward the sound of their voices. He found a vantage point overlooking the main floor and surveyed the scene. In the center of the room was a makeshift cage, its steel bars hastily welded together. Around it, the men lounged, their weapons resting within easy reach. A sudden sound behind Frank made him freeze, a faint creak of a floorboard. He turned just in time to see one of the guards, his eyes wide with surprise. Frank moved without hesitation. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing the man's weapon and twisting it from his grasp. A sharp elbow to the jaw sent the guard crumpling to the floor, unconscious. Frank dragged the body into the shadows, his heart pounding. The noise had been minimal, but it was enough to put him on edge. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. Returning to his vantage point, Frank formulated a plan. He couldn't take them all head-on, not without turning the fight into a bloodbath. But he could level the playing field. His eyes landed on an old control panel across the room. If he could activate it, the mill's ancient machinery might provide the distraction he needed. Slipping back into the shadows, Frank made his way toward the panel, staying low to avoid detection. The floor creaked under his weight, but the noise of the men's conversation masked his approach. Reaching the panel, Frank inspected it quickly. It was rusty and outdated, but functional enough. He flipped a few switches, and the building roared to life. Gears ground together, belts whirred, and the lights flickered. The men on the floor sprang to their feet, their weapons drawn. "What the hell is that?" one of them shouted, his voice laced with panic. Frank didn't wait for them to figure it out. Using the confusion to his advantage, he descended from his position, his movements swift and precise. The first man didn't even see him coming. A swift blow to the back of the neck sent him sprawling. The others reacted quickly, but Frank was faster. He ducked behind a column as gunfire erupted, the bullets ricocheting off the metal walls. Adrenaline coursed through him as he moved from cover to cover, systematically taking down his opponents. A disarmed pipe from the floor became a weapon in his hands, its weight familiar as he used it to disable another attacker. Within minutes, the room was silent except for the whir of the machinery. Frank stood in the center, his breath coming in controlled gasps. Around him, the men lay unconscious, their weapons scattered. He turned his attention to the cage. Whatever was meant to happen here, it wouldn't go according to their plan. Frank knew this wasn't over. The man who had sent these goons would come looking for answers, and when he did, Frank would be ready. For now, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The Bonebreaker wasn't just a legend. He was real, and anyone who threatened his family was about to find out just how real. The aftermath of the fight in the abandoned mill hung in the air like the stench of burnt oil. Frank Johnson stood amid the wreckage, his chest rising and falling steadily as his eyes swept over the unconscious bodies scattered across the floor. The whirring machinery he had activated was beginning to wind down, the flickering lights above casting jagged shadows over the scene. This wasn't victory. Frank knew that much. It was only the beginning. He crouched beside the taller of the two men from the night before, who lay slumped against a support beam. Blood trickled from a cut on the man's temple where Frank had struck him with a brutal efficiency that even he hadn't realized he still possessed. Frank patted the man down, finding a phone in his jacket pocket. Holding it up, he activated the screen. There was only one name in the call history: Boss. Frank stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening. Whoever this boss was, they had made a grave mistake involving his family. Frank tapped the contact and brought the phone to his ear, listening to the dial tone echo faintly in the large room. On the third ring, a deep, calm voice answered. "I assume this isn't one of my men." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "No, it's not," he said evenly. "It's Frank Johnson." There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. "Ah, the infamous bone breaker. I'd hoped we'd meet under different circumstances." "You made this personal," Frank said, his voice cold and deliberate. "You came after my family." "You left me little choice," the boss replied smoothly. "Legends don't simply walk away from their stories, Frank. The people I work with, they crave proof. Proof that even the great Frank Johnson can bleed." Frank's expression hardened. "You're going to find out just how wrong you are." The voice on the other end sighed, as though disappointed. "You should be careful with your threats. They might make you feel strong, but they won't protect the people you love." Before Frank could respond, the call ended. He lowered the phone, his mind racing. The boss's calm demeanor told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over, and the next move wouldn't be his to make. Frank straightened, tossing the phone onto the chest of the unconscious man. He needed to move quickly. If the boss's men found out what had happened here, there would be reinforcements before long. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his breathing labored. He had stayed back during the fight, following Frank's orders, but the sounds of combat had clearly shaken him. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice shaky. "For now," Frank replied curtly. He grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen men and handed it to Ethan. "We need to leave. Now." Ethan looked down at the weapon, his hands trembling as he took it. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they won't find us," Frank said, already heading toward the back exit of the mill. They moved through the woods in silence, the morning light filtering through the trees. Frank led the way, his senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, felt like a potential threat. Ethan struggled to keep up, his nerves clearly frayed. After nearly an hour of walking, they emerged onto a dirt road far from the mill. Frank stopped, turning to face Ethan. "You have a choice," he said, his tone firm. "You can run and try to disappear, or you can stick with me and see this through." Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching Frank's face for some sign of reassurance. "You think you can take them all down?" "I don't think," Frank said. "I know." Ethan nodded slowly, his grip on the rifle tightening. "I'm in." Frank's plan unfolded with military precision. He contacted an old friend, a man he trusted from his days in the service, who provided him with the resources he needed: untraceable phones, clean weapons, and most importantly, information. Within hours, Frank had pieced together the network behind the boss. The operation was larger than he'd expected. The boss wasn't just running fights. He was trafficking weapons, laundering money, and using fear to control entire communities. But every empire had its weak points, and Frank was determined to find them. The first strike came that night. Frank and Ethan hit a warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the boss's men stored cash and weapons. Frank moved like a shadow, his actions swift and deliberate. Ethan followed his lead, the fear in his eyes slowly giving way to determination. By dawn, the warehouse was a smoldering ruin, its contents destroyed. Frank left a single message scrawled on the wall in spray paint, "Not on my watch." The retaliation was swift. The boss's men descended on Frank's home, but he had anticipated the move. By the time they arrived, the house was empty, the family safely hidden miles away. Frank had left traps behind, tripwires, alarms, and strategically placed distractions that bought him time to strike elsewhere. Over the next several days, Frank dismantled the boss's operation piece by piece. He cut supply lines, intercepted communications, and sowed chaos among the ranks. The legend of the Bonebreaker wasn't just alive, it was thriving. Finally, the boss made his move. Frank received a message, a location and a time. It was clear, this would be the final confrontation. Frank arrived at the abandoned airstrip just before midnight. The vast expanse was lit by the glow of headlights, a dozen vehicles forming a makeshift arena. The boss stood in the center, flanked by armed guards. "You've been busy," the boss said, his voice carrying across the open space. Frank stepped forward, unarmed but resolute. "You wanted me," he said. "Here I am." The boss smiled faintly. "And here we end this." The fight that followed was brutal, a clash of strength and will. Frank moved with a precision born of years of training, his fists landing with devastating accuracy. The boss was skilled, but he underestimated the fire that drove Frank. When it was over, the boss lay unconscious on the ground, his empire shattered. Frank stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles bloodied but his resolve unbroken. The crowd dispersed quickly, their fear outweighing any loyalty they had to the fallen leader. Frank watched them go, his mind already turning to the future. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ensuring that no one would ever threaten his family again. And as Frank walked away from the airstrip, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, he knew one thing for certain: the Bonebreaker would rest easy, but only once his family's safety was absolute. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.